So while we were on our break, one of today's attendees swung by and asked me a couple of questions as it pertains to information marking, media marking, things like that. The question was centered around the use of data loss prevention tools to sort of affix a marking onto a document digitally so that you then can make decisions around that. And that whole question sort of branched off into how do we do media marking? How do we enhance our 036 practice for CUI handling procedures through some sort of technology implementation? I think that's really valuable because when we're dealing with most DoD contractors, the general CUI information that almost always ends up becoming a part of their discussion falls into only two categories. The first category is controlled technical information, or CTI, and then the second category is export controlled information, which is either going to be ITAR or EAR export controlled information. Now, the reason why I'm so interested in data loss prevention and information flow control, CUI handling, as it pertains to those two data types, is sort of a secret weapon that exists for those two data types. Both of those data types already have something called a limited dissemination control attached to them. So for CTI, controlled technical information, we have something called DoD distribution statements that are already on those documents in the header and footer, or in the title page, or in a text box on a drawing. And the reason that I'm really focused on those limited dissemination controls is because they have to contain specific sentence statements in those distribution statements that optical character recognition or DLP tools can see on a document. So if I were to take all of the DoD distribution statements, B through F, that represent limited dissemination on a document, and I've got a tool that can see those specific strings of text on a document, I know I'm dealing with CTI, full stop. That's an incredibly powerful tool, with so many people saying, what the heck is CUI? I don't know what my CUI is or is not. Those limited dissemination controls that have already been in use for 30 years are already at our disposal. Same thing with export controlled information. Whether we're talking about ITAR or EAR, US code requirements state that we have to put an exact statement on those documents for their ITAR or EAR markings. Again, it's a unique string of text that I can see on a document and then immediately make decisions from a data loss prevention perspective. So that is a great way to create better inputs for technical tools that are going to be used to enforce things like your CUI handling procedures. So thanks for that question that came in. If any of you have questions as we go, this is completely interactive. You can ask whatever you'd like, and we'll answer it as we go. So as we head into this next set of CMMC practices, we're going to be talking about things that are more related to situational awareness. That's a specific focus area within an information security program, or as we said before, you're going to try and get better inputs so that you can take better actions. So if we go into the first of the newly added CMMC practices, the 048 practice, this is a requirement that we have to actually collect system logs into at least one central repository. Now again, this is something that's being added that is above and beyond what we would read in NIST 800-171. The simple fact is that if I can get all my logs into one place, it's going to make it way easier to correlate these logs against each other, and then also to pull more informed or rich reports and things like that that will actually cut down on my system monitoring workload. So if we were to get rid of this particular requirement, effectively what we would have would be the existing logging requirements from 800-171, which is obviously that we have to create, but then we have to retain system logs. Most organizations are going to look at a central repository as a way to set one log retention policy and then simply apply it to all their collected logs. It's a lot harder to do log retention if those logs are staying on the device where they're generated, not to mention the fact that they're way easier for an attacker to destroy. If you're shipping those logs, you're always going to guarantee that those copied logs that have been sent off can be retained even if the system they came from is impacted. And you can see here we already have a requirement to correlate logs so that we can do review and analysis. You can definitely do correlation just between a few systems, or you can do it ad hoc later by doing log exports and bringing them all together and trying to correlate and report on them that way. But you're going to spend a lot less time and effort if they're already in one central repository, because you can just do timestamp synchronized searches across devices or VLANs or whatever you would like, and it's just going to be a lot less labor intensive to do it that way. And again, if you are operating in the cloud under FedRAMP moderate equivalency, you'd already need to be looking at central log repository as part of FedRAMP moderate equivalency. So if you're doing any of the stuff that we're talking about today in a cloud environment, you're probably already on the hook to do this anyways. So this is, CMMC is just bringing something up that maybe you are already committed to doing. So the next practice that we have here is the 097 practice. In case you can't tell, incident response was probably the most enhanced of all of the domains from within CMMC. And that's just due to the fact that there was a lot of emphasis by the DoD in the creation of the CMMC model to really flesh out that aspect of every organization's InfoSec program. So you can see here we've got a requirement that we perform root cause analysis on the incidents themselves to figure out how the heck they happened. That's pretty straightforward, and it's really mostly not a unique requirement. It's something that's actually pulled out of the Computer Security Incident Handling Guide that NIST publishes, which is the informative source that you're given in 800-171 to go look at when you stand up your overall incident handling capability. So if we were to get rid of this requirement, really, the original 800-171 set of requirements don't really speak to post-incident or root cause analysis. We do have to do recovery, we do have to do some sort of analysis, but there's nothing that says we actually have to do that kind of analysis post-incident. But if we're going to develop plans of action, which is 3.12.2 out of 800-171, they have to be based on some sort of identified deficiency or vulnerability. That's almost always what you end up identifying after an incident. How did this happen? Well, this unpatched system or this misconfiguration is what led to the attacker being able to successfully execute on their plan. Okay, how do we fix that? We build a plan of action. So again, the CMMC practice that we're talking about here isn't necessarily adding new burden. If anything, it's just clearing up confusion between previously disjointed requirements. I again will point out that if we're going to do any sort of support of the DoD for any forensic analysis they want from us after an incident happens, there's that 90-day window. If I don't want DC3 having to go through my entire environment to figure out what happened, if I do root cause analysis on what took place, I might only need to isolate a limited number of system images and export a limited number of logs and have a tidy little post-incident, sort of digital evidence locker that I've got off to the side in case DC3 needs it. That's going to allow me to go back to operating as a normal business much more quickly. So again, if I've already got those DFARS requirements for evidence collection and to understand what happened, if I don't know the scope of the incident through post-incident analysis, I don't know when I can stop collecting evidence. So the next practice that we would have here on the list is the 144 practice. This comes out of the risk management family, which is really just sort of a mashup of things that were previously in 800-171 families. The risk management domain does add some new practices, and you can see here this is one of them. Really, this is just building on a concept that we already had in 800-171, which is to do risk assessments. So there's already a risk assessment requirement. I believe it's 3.11.1 in NIST 800-171. But what the authors of the CMMC model here are saying is that, and this might be a little more academic, but they're saying you can't really do a proper risk assessment unless you have certain defined categories you assess against. So specific risk categories, specific sources of risk, specific measurement criteria. If you haven't done a quantitative risk assessment before, this would be doing things like not only figuring out the impact level of the risk that you're talking about, but assigning specific measures to it. So the value of a contract that a realized risk could jeopardize, the overall number of hours it might take to restore a system that was completely taken down by ransomware, the number of people you might need to subcontract in order to do IR if you don't have that in-house. Whatever these risks are, if you can assign measures to them, then it allows you to do some more prioritization. So if you've got a big dollar price tag of negative outcome attached to something that's also a critical, high impact, high probability risk, that might allow you to focus in on that specific risk in your assessment and manage it more effectively. So again, if we were to get rid of the 144 practice, we would still have our original risk assessment requirement, which is a little more broad. But then we also have some specific requirements in DFARS that are, again, somewhat nebulous. I'm just at least trying to provide some connectivity here between DFARS and what we have in CMMC. The adequate security requirements that we talked about this morning, paragraph B, they say, here's your run book. If it's an organizationally owned system, you do 800-171. If it's a cloud system, you need to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent. But then there's a third requirement in adequate security. It's any other security measures identified by the organization based on an assessed risk or vulnerability. So basically, you do a risk assessment, you identify some new deficiency, and there isn't an 800-171 requirement written for it. You would still be contractually required, if you assess and identify that risk in your required risk assessment, and it's a measurable risk and you're not doing anything about it, there's still sort of like this nascent contractual obligation to still put a security measure in place to protect against that newly identified risk. This is really just a catch-all from the DoD's perspective to try and encourage you to, hey, don't stop at 800-171. If new evolving threat landscapes reveal new risks or deficiencies, and our slow-moving government systems of model building are not yet written to address that particular issue or risk, it's your job as the contractor to go come up with an additional security measure and put that in place. So we're already seeing some practical examples of this just through U.S. cert advisories or what we're seeing in executive orders. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but hey, there's a new risk. It's cyber risk impacting the supply chain. It's software driven. We need better rules for software bill of materials and for vulnerability disclosures from private sector. These are like the actual things that are running through Congress right now and that will either become law soon or a regulation or whatever it may be. They have broad unilateral support. So when these new deficiencies or vulnerabilities sort of rear their ugly head, paragraph B, item 3 says that we still have to come up with our own security measures and put those in place. The 146 practice is all about developing implementation and mitigation plans for those risks. This is very closely aligned with this original requirement that we build plans of action. But at the end of the day, this is more so about having like a high-level risk management strategy. In fact, the federal control that was used to build this practice is PM9 out of the program management family of NIST controls, and that is actually risk management strategy. So if I have measurable risks, then I can start to assign risk tolerances and risk thresholds to those risks. So if anyone here wants to cheat on your risk management strategy, your risk tolerance should not include any definitions of compromise from paragraph A of 7012. You shouldn't tolerate unauthorized disclosure. You shouldn't tolerate copying of media onto unauthorized media. You shouldn't tolerate the destruction or modification of CUI. So wink, wink, if you were to set those as your risk tolerance levels in your risk management strategy, you're not doing anything crazy or above and beyond your existing contractual obligations, and you're checking boxes. So I'm just saying. So if you were to do what's in 144 and you've got your criteria, and then you're starting to assign risk thresholds and risk tolerances, that then will turn around and satisfy the 146 practice, which is to have risk mitigation plans. You can write a risk mitigation plan before you have an identified risk by setting your tolerances and your risk appetites and saying, I'm not willing to allow this to happen, so if that type of risk ever shows up, we are not going to just accept that risk, we are going to attempt to mitigate. So again, if we were to take the 146 practice out of existence, we already have our paragraph B, part 3 requirement that anytime we have a newly assessed risk, we have to mitigate it. It's written right into paragraph B. So we should do some things in regards to that no matter what, even if we're not necessarily going to be assessed against a specific numbered practice. We're already required to remediate vulnerabilities, which are their own form of risk. And of course, we have to implement plans of action. So that's to be expected as well. One of the things that I just want to point out, has anybody here actually gone to US CERT's website and looked at security advisories that they publish? So when the dark side ransomware attacks for the Colonial Pipeline came out, there'd be a security advisory for that. If you read that document, you're given specific things in specifically named paragraphs that might be of help in this specific part of the model. For example, there's an entire section that just says, here are all of the threats and tactics and procedures and techniques that are used by the attacker. So here's the high-level threat, here's the TTPs. Now you actually have a specific threat catalog that you can be building. Those are measurable risk criteria in your risk assessment. The next section that's in the security advisory is literally called risk mitigations. If I have to build a risk mitigation plan and I've got a security advisory with a section titled risk mitigations, how hard is it going to be to just write plan on the end of that and send it in an email to someone and say, here's what I think we could do? I'm not trying to be incredibly innovative in this type of situation. Take all of the millions, if not billions of dollars that are being spent by the federal government to do their own care and feeding of cyber threats and advisories, and just bring that into your organization and just repurpose it for your own needs. This doesn't have to be a managed SOC who's going to tell you about this dark web threat that no one's heard of. Those are good, that's great, but I'm also just as much for small business going to want to repurpose existing guidance, existing threat intel, existing risk mitigations that are already out there, that are already vetted and qualified by federal agencies, and not have to do a lot of original work here. So again, just encouragements to see these practices for what they are, which is just encapsulating things that we already have out there. The next practice that we have, the 162 practice, this is a requirement to specifically test and assess any software that we develop internally. So how many organizations here actually develop your own software in-house? So some, but not all. So let's just think about this for a second. For a lot of you, this practice doesn't even apply. It's not applicable to your organization. You don't develop enterprise software internally. So if that's the case, this is a prime candidate for submitting for an exception. Now, caveat, right now, the DoD CIO's office only answers questions about and approves plan variances for NIST 800-171. So if you're going to ask for a distinction or a plan variance approval for a CMMC Delta practice, which is what we're talking through here right now, the DoD CIO's office, they will stand mute. They don't have guidance on how to respond to that yet. They're literally saying, not my job yet. We'll see what happens when DFAR's final rulemaking concludes here in a few weeks. What will most likely happen is that all of the DoD CIO plan variance processes that are already called out for you in DFAR 7012 will probably be re-expressed in 7021 to include adjudication by the DoD CIO to say, that works, that's fine, that's not applicable, you're good to go. So this would be a prime candidate. If you don't do software development, in-house. You don't have any in-house developed software to assess, so there's nothing to do here. Now, this is actually one of the only CMMC practices that has absolutely no correlation to anything that's in 800-171 or anything that's in 7012. So why are we talking about it? Well, for one, if it's in the CMMC model and you want to pursue that, that's great. But I don't know if any of you have been paying attention to executive orders this year. There's kind of this thing that the Biden administration put out saying that any software that's developed for use by the federal government needs to have a software bill of materials within 180 days and needs to start doing mandatory vulnerability disclosure. And if the code that's in your compiled code is disclosed as being vulnerable, you basically have to do something about that within set timelines as a software developer creating software for the federal government. So if you're a DoD contractor and you're making software for an agency or for a prime that is going to be used by an agency, this is going to be really applicable to you really soon. In fact, this doesn't even scrape the surface of what's in the Biden EO. So you should probably be thinking of that as it's sort of its own topic that needs to be built out, and the entire software development life cycle that exists just for those topics. Also, if you're a government contractor and you're doing software development, you're probably already CMMI level 3, which is its own maturity model for software dev. So chances are you were already doing this top to bottom before CMMC ever showed up. So threat intelligence, situational awareness, this is sort of the one of the more stringent practices that exist in the Delta 20. And this is a requirement to actually take in and do something about threat intelligence. This is a little more out into sort of more robust security programs and things like that, because what we're really doing here is saying it's not enough to just passively receive security alerts and advisories, which is already in the model. It's already in 800-171. So it's not enough for me to just get like my vendor reaching out to me saying, hey, don't forget to update your firewall because there's a new 0 day. That's good, that's great. Threat intelligence is actually putting together the ways that attackers do what they do and saying, here's the exact profile and the procedures they're going to follow and how they're going to go after you. So if you see these indicators of compromise on your network because they're doing it to you, here's how you spot that. So I just mentioned a moment ago, US CERT advisories that actually lay out TTPs, like the specific techniques and tactics and procedures that are in use by attackers. This is what we're talking about when we talk about threat intel. So if I can take this more high-level information that is getting into some of the exact things I can expect to see manifested in my network, I can actually build out better detection for that happening. The folks at Microsoft who were, we were going through some of their capabilities before, you can jump into pre-built workbooks or playbooks in a lot of those systems that say, this is strange activity, I don't care who you are, you should know about that happening on your network, and then you can just immediately have a pre-built, like built-in detection for that. You don't have to go craft this custom detection rule for that sort of IOC that could be out there. Plenty of other security vendors also do this. That's how we're getting into the age of signatureless malware detection and things like that. We can see strange behavior even if we haven't seen it before. But you won't be able to get credit for having those tools in place if you aren't matching that capability that your security tool provides with an actual threat intel alert that you've received. You have to start putting those together. So when we work with organizations, a lot of times we'll take them through the 3 or 4 most recent security bulletins or advisories from US CERT and have them read all of the risk mitigations that are in that alert and then say, which CMMC practice is that? Which one is that? Hey, look, this says implement multi-factor authentication. Really? Interesting. Hey, which CMMC practice is 083? Okay, great. Take credit for having put that in place. You put it in place, right? Okay, here's your threat intel. Here's the action you've already taken. Take credit for the work you've already done. If you can start to do that as a monthly exercise when the assessors show up, there's going to be no question that you're responding to threat intelligence, because you can match up those threat advisories with the security actions that you've already taken in your program. So again, a lot of this is just taking credit for what you're already obligated to do. So again, if we got rid of the 169 practice in its entirety, we would still be needing to monitor system security alerts and advisories. Again, this is a little more passive of an activity. We're not out there looking for specific threat actor profiles and things like that. We're just kind of passively waiting for a vendor to tell us that we've got a problem with the vendor tool that we use. But still, it's aligned with that same spectrum of receiving information and acting on it. So, this is module 3. So the next section that we get into here has to do with phishing, ransomware, and malware. So these are some of the more emerging threats where the CMMC model is trying to get out ahead of some of the most common things that impact organizations and craft practices around those so that we can start to get ahead of the game, not just necessarily protecting CUI in this case, but actually improving the resiliency of the organization overall. So the first thing that we would have in this practice is the 137 practice. This is a requirement that we not only do data backups, but then we test those data backups. Now, I just want to pause for a minute because this is a section we're treading into right now that I legitimately believe does add real regulatory burden above and beyond what was ever specified in NIST 800-171. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is this still a good idea regardless? So let me explain myself. If we think back to what we began this conversation with, NIST 800-171 is just the moderate impact confidentiality controls from 853 boiled down into a set of requirements. That means that when NIST created 800-171, they deliberately ignored anything that wasn't related to confidentiality. So on the CIA triad, we've got confidentiality, integrity, availability. Confidentiality, priority number 1. Integrity, don't care. Availability, don't care. If it's not directly related to confidentiality, I don't care. So is that good for business? Probably not. Is that good for data protection? Sure. So we have to come to grips with the fact that NIST 800-171, as written, it's not an information security program. It is a bolt-on data privacy program that you put on your existing information security program. As soon as we can come to grips with that, things start to make more sense. Because all the parts of the model of a normal information security program that are missing, you don't go crazy trying to figure out how to do those inside of 800-171. You realize that 800-171 bolts onto that broader effort. So what we see here in these overall resiliency practices that are in this section are things that are being added to improve your overall information security program. But I really do believe that these go above and beyond just confidentiality emphasis. Why? Well, data backups are purely, for most organizations, an availability or an integrity discussion. Can I keep my systems up? If the system goes down, can I restore from a backup? This is all about uptime. So when we get into these discussions, we should point out the fact that I want every business to be able to meet its internally defined availability requirements and uptime needs. Everybody wants that, right? But if I was to pick something to do later in my implementation rather than sooner, unless I'm specifically investing in infrastructure along the way to implementing other things in the model, I would be okay with waiting until later to tackle these particular requirements, because if the model were to change and these were to be deemed too much of a regulatory burden and they were going to be wiped off the map, I might have been working on these when I could have been working on something that's already contractually required in 800-171. So this is just cost-benefit analysis from a pure compliance perspective. Everything that we're going to talk about in this section is actually good for your business. And if it's continued to be required in CMMC level 3, you're also going to have to do it for compliance reasons. But if I was just asking you to be confidentiality oriented, we might not be having these conversations. So the 137 practice, you're being told here in the explanation from Carnegie Mellon that this is obviously part of a more broad cybersecurity program. If we were to take this away, the only thing that really ties into this requirement is just our ability to test our incident response capability. So again, this is a requirement about testing backups. The only time that those two would overlap would be if we were to tabletop or simulate an incident that involves downtime, and then we would restore from backups as a way to test our incident response capability. So very common occurrence during incidents to have that type of event take place, but that's really the only overlap that we have here. If we move over to the next related practice, this is kind of like just dogpiling onto the 137 practice. It's not enough to perform backups and test them. We need to make sure that the backups are very robust in accordance with very specific uptime requirements. So if we were to actually unpack all of the practice objectives for the 139 practice, oh man, it's like a whole other model just buried inside of just this practice. So when I say that there's probably some additional regulatory burden, like look no further than the 139 practice. Pull up the practice objectives for this. It's telling me that our organization has to have fully defined recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. So we're basically building a DR plan like within this requirement. So the other objectives that we have are obviously to do more testing and then to use automation whenever feasible to perform our backups, and then making sure that the backups themselves can't be directly attacked in the same vector as the production environment. So I mean, we're getting in the weeds on some real system architecture here if we satisfy all of the practice objectives that are in this particular practice. So again, this is another practice that there aren't direct linkages between any of our existing requirements. Now, I will say, if I really had to put on my mapping hat and dig deep and find a connection here, if you read in the 7012 clause itself, it tells me two things that would relate to this. The first is my incident obligations for reporting. If, and this is a big if I am a contractor that provides something called operationally critical support, which is almost always specified as operating critical infrastructure for the government, or I'm doing some sort of major logistics support, like airlift or sea lift or ground transpo, something big like that, and an incident impacts my ability to actually do my contract with the government, I would have to report that even if CUI was never impacted. So that is one area where, if I'm not up and running in a robust, comprehensive way, and my ability to perform contracts would be impacted, then I might have something there that would drive me to build out this robust data backup program. So that's probably the only linkage that I could create between this practice and something that we already have as an existing obligation. But because so many DoD contractors aren't doing that type of work, they're not an operationally critical contractor. For most of us, this is above and beyond what we see in our obligations. The next practice that we have here is a requirement to use encrypted sessions for actually managing network devices. So this is a situation where I've got, let's say, a network firewall or a wireless access point, and I need to log into that device, the actual device itself, and do work. So this isn't necessarily just me, interacting with the network itself. This is more so about, actually doing sysadmin work where I have direct access to the device. I'm changing a firewall rule. I'm setting an IDS parameter. I'm doing something that's more administrative in nature. If we were to take away all of the additional practices, including this one, we really wouldn't be changing much of anything. And the reason for that is we already have to use cryptographic mechanisms to protect remote access sessions. And so most organizations, if they're going to be logging into a network device, they could be doing that completely locally, like on just their local network. That's good, but they could also be doing that from a remote location. Standard practice is that you're going to use a VPN connection and a trusted endpoint to do network administration from anyways. That also leans into your CMMC requirements for having logical access restrictions and physical access restrictions for changes being made to the system. Encryption would be your logical access restriction. And then we already have to protect the authenticity of communication sessions. So if we completely finish all of our 800.171 implementations and somehow never thought about what it would be like to manage a firewall and never put any encrypted tunneling in place or session requirements in place for that, it's a bold strategy, Cotton. We'll see if it pays off. But the overall, I think that we're probably going to have solved for this anyways. So this doesn't really add a lot of additional implementation requirements. The 147 practice is a little farther afield of some of the things we've already talked about today. This is a pretty standalone requirement that if we have non-vendor supported products, I was talking with someone earlier about what do you do with old embedded legacy systems? If I've got a manufacturing shop floor and I've got an embedded operating system in a $7 million CNC machine, I'm not replacing it. So now what do I do in light of the fact that I can't do anything about that non-vendor supported system? The requirement here is that we have to have a special management plan for those contingencies. So for most organizations, the first step you would take if you run across a situation where a product goes end of life and it's no longer vendor supported, which means it's no longer getting security updates, which means the moment any underlying component of that system has an announced vulnerability, I can no longer fix it, which means I'm no longer compliant because I can't do flaw remediation and I can't do any maintenance and I can't respond to security alerts or advisories. So that means that for that particular unsupported device, I don't see how I could possibly remain compliant if I'm going to keep that in my scope. So I've got two choices at this point. Either I can ask the DoD CIO for a special exemption to keep that baby running, in which case they're going to be saying, you're still using what? Or I can come up with a way to not process CUI in that critical business system. So if there's a way that CUI is not going to be used in that environment, and then ideally if I can isolate that tool or component out of my normal environment through logical separation, maybe a separate network or something like that, get it away from the internet as far as possible, then it's just going to be objectively out of scope for CMMC implementations anyways, so we're not even talking about it anymore. So a lot of times the special risk management strategy that we would come up with for a non-vendor supported component or piece of equipment is literally to make it not subject to CMMC anymore, if that makes sense. So if we were to take that away, we would still have the requirement to monitor system security alerts, advisories, and take actions. But again, as soon as I can't take an action because there are no actions to take, it's going to be really difficult for me to remain in compliance, because I don't know if any of you have looked at a security alert advisory for an old end-of-life Cisco switch or something like that. You know what the advisory action is always to do? Is replace the switch or update to a supported version. If you can't do either of those, then you can't follow the security advisory, so you're not going to be in compliance. Finally, we get to the grouping of practices that have to do specifically with email-based threats. So it might seem strange to specifically focus on this particular threat vector, but the simple fact of the matter is that most threats initiate on an endpoint, an individual workstation, and a lot of the times it's either going to be a web-based attack vector or an email-based attack vector. And all email is trying to do is to get you to click on the link to launch the web-based attack vector. So email in and of itself is organizationally maybe not one of the most managed components of people's daily lives. A lot of people are making, let's just say, high stress decisions around email. They don't take the time to go breathe and then come back and sit down and get to inbox zero. And so a lot of people are making distracted, impulsive decisions when email is involved, and that's usually how a lot of security incidents take place. I find it interesting that if you look at the DoD's assigned parameters for any national security system, the only thing they absolutely require for a national security system from a training topics perspective is managing the delivery of malware over email. It's the only thing they require. I think that is interesting because it seems to be a common threat vector regardless of whether you are an agency or whether you're private sector. So when we get into these email practices, the first one we come across here is a requirement to specifically have spam protections in place for email. Well, it's really spam protection at any entry and exit points. And the reason that I point out that email is the primary topic of this, but we're finding spam come into organizations plenty of other ways in today's landscape. We talked about social media earlier. We're seeing very enterprising attackers start to deliver spam via messaging tools like Slack or Teams or WhatsApp or you name it. There's all sorts of different ways for spam to find its way into organizations today. And so spam protection mechanisms are mostly going to be focused on email, but just maybe be thinking about some of those other ways that spam could get into an organization. So again, if we were to sort of delete this practice, the only thing that we would have left over is the fact that that spam protection requirement says that we need to put it two places, in entry and exit points. Entry and exit is going to represent key internal boundaries and external boundaries in the system. So there is some connection here with protecting the overall networks at those key boundaries. And so if we're looking for ways to protect networks at their boundaries, usually that's going to be done through some sort of gateway antivirus or spam filter, and it's going to be done through some sort of intrusion detection or prevention tool. And so if we're going to treat email as a key external boundary and for internal email as an internal boundary, it makes sense that we would try to put protections in place for that. So a lot of the spam protection that we would put in place are also directly linked to our next practice here, which is to implement email forgery protections. So you can see here in the explanations from SCI, they actually give us some specific examples. We've got SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. These are all tools you can put in place in your email system that allow you to do two things. One, you can inform other people that you're sending email to that your email is indeed legitimate. And then you can also validate when email is received that it comes from the party who claims to have sent it. So a lot of these email-based attacks that we heard about earlier, the business email compromises from the FBI, those usually happen when organizations don't check the overall header and envelope information of an email, allowing it to be spoofed and look legitimate. If someone is sending a modified email that looks like it came from one source, but it's actually modified and coming from another email domain, that's the general underlying layman's term explanations of how spoofing works. These email forgery tools confirm that they are indeed coming from who claims to have sent them, and they will bounce or drop or alert on an email that is being spoofed. So this is a way that we would be able to stop that from happening. The spoofing it's a threat for every business. It's not necessarily a CUI specific threat, but this could be the source of a lot of reported incidents. So if we can just stop these at the door, it's going to reduce the scenarios where we have to go do triage and event analysis to find out if we've got a reportable incident.